Olá, eu sou Caio, uma inteligência artificial. Senhoras e senhores, boa noite. É com grande prazer que iniciamos o primeiro dia do Health Week, terceira edição, dedicado à neurociência. Nosso primeiro palestrante é Daniel Goleman, uma autoridade mundial em inteligência emocional. Formado em Harvard, Dr. Goleman lecionou psicologia e foi redator científico do The New York Times. Em 1995, publicou Inteligência Emocional, transformando o conceito em um fenômeno global. Este livro permaneceu na lista de best-sellers do New York Times por mais de um ano e foi traduzido para mais de 40 idiomas. Além disso, é autor de Foco e Trabalhando com a Inteligência Emocional. Ele cofundou a Collaborative for Academic, Social and Emotional Learning, CAL, e co-dirige o Consortium for Research on Emotional Intelligence in Organizations, na Rutgers University. Hoje, nos apresentará Emotional Intelligence for Healthcare Professionals, destacando a importância da inteligência emocional na saúde. Com vocês, Daniel Goleman.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Daniel Goleman. You may know about me for my work and writing on emotional intelligence. Today, I'm going to talk about emotional intelligence in healthcare. And if we could have the first slide, please. There are four parts to emotional intelligence in my model. The top shows self awareness and self management. Self management, handling your own emotions, really depends on self awareness. And then the next set is social awareness that comes down to empathy and knowing that means knowing what the other person is feeling. And that's the basis for handling relationships well. And I would say that healthcare, that excellence in healthcare really depends on how well you can do these four things. For example, self awareness, that means knowing what you're feeling as you're feeling it, knowing how it's shaping your perceptions and your thoughts and your impulse to act. That's so important for the next part, which is managing those feelings. And this is essential in healthcare. You want to be with an expert in healthcare who you feel as a patient, for example, is really competent, really calm, really caring. So the more disruptive your emotions, as you may well know, the narrower your bandwidth for taking in information, whether it's a diagnosis or what the remedy may be with that diagnosis. But in other words, you need to have cognitive clarity, and cognitive clarity increases the calmer you are. You also want to stay positive no matter what the situation presents you. And in today's healthcare reality, there's a change all the time. You need to respond agilely to that change. And you also always need to keep your eye on the goal, on what really matters in this encounter, in your day, in your career, and keep your eye on that goal despite the distractions of the day. Now, I want to go down to that social awareness. This is, of course, the key to effective relationship. Social awareness comes in three varieties. When you talk about empathy, there's cognitive empathy, knowing how the other person thinks about the situation, the language they use to talk to themselves about it. If you understand that with cognitive clarity, then you know how to talk to that person effectively because you know the language they'll understand, for example. So, cognitive clarity, of course, is very important for anyone in healthcare to have effective communication. But then there's something else. There's a second kind of empathy, which is actually based in a different part of the brain. It's based in the social circuits of the brain, which are in the forebrain. And this is emotional empathy. It turns out that when we're with someone else, our brains form an instantaneous, automatic, unconscious bridge to that other person's brain. And emotions pass through that bridge. So we know what the other person is feeling, we sense it in ourselves. We know what they're intending, we sense that. This is what keeps any relationship, any interaction on the same page. Emotional empathy, absolutely crucial, I'd say. in being an effective healthcare professional. But there's a third kind of empathy, which I feel is the most important. Technically, it's called empathic concern. It means you not only know how the person thinks and how they feel, you care about them. You want what's best for them. There was an article a while back in the prestigious Journal of the American Medical Association, and it compared physicians who had been sued for incompetence uh, compared to other physicians of the same experience, the same level of profession. And they found that there was actually no difference in between those who were sued and those who weren't in their medical competence. The difference was in how they related to their patients. The doctors who weren't sued took a little more time. They tell a few jokes, they banter, they talk, ask about the patient. In other words, they form a personal relationship along with the professional relationship. And this made a huge difference. Being sued is a general index, you could say, of patient satisfaction or dissatisfaction. But it makes me think of research that was done here in the States at Boston University, where they took top leaders from many different companies. Each leader was identified by their own company as being highly effective. And they did videos of them with their direct reports. And what they found was telling. There was 3 times more laughter with the top 10% leaders than there was with other leaders. And it's not that they were telling jokes, it's that people felt relaxed with them. So they were able to laugh spontaneously. And I think that atmosphere of feeling relaxed, feeling connected is crucial when you're with a patient or when you're with anyone else in the medical profession. There was a study done at Harvard Medical School where they filmed patients and their doctors, and then they showed the video of that interaction to the patient afterward. And the patient identified 2 things. The patient said, right now, the doctor is really tuned into me, really empathizing, really understands and listens, versus the doctor didn't get me, didn't understand, actually didn't care. And it turned out when the patient said the doctor was really empathic, really tuned in, the physiology of the patient and the doctor were like 2 birds flying in formation. When the patient said the doctor didn't really get me, didn't care, there was no connection. So in other words, tuning into the patient, having rapport, forms a very strong relationship, one that actually impacts the physiology of the person you're with. And in another study, people waiting for a doctor were asked, how many questions do you have for your doctor? And the answer was on average about 4. The same patients were asked after a session with a healthcare professional, and they asked, how many questions did you actually ask? And the average was 1.5. So what happened, they realized, was that in the interaction with that professional, the doctor or the nurse, whoever it was, cut off the patient after a few seconds and took over the conversation. So the patient never got to voice what their other concerns were, what their other questions were. And you have to realize as a healthcare professional that whenever you're with someone you're caring for, you are the more powerful person in that dyad. And the more powerful person sends emotion. So there was a study done, really remarkable, where they gave someone negative feedback in a very positive tone of voice, and that person came out feeling pretty positive after the interaction. In the same study, they gave very positive feedback in a very negative, cold, aloof voice, and that person came out of the interaction feeling, I have to say, pretty negative. So, tone of voice, the nonverbals in the interaction actually matter immensely for how the patient is going to feel, how the person is going to feel after that interaction. I was once in a fancy deli. I was once in a fancy deli in Manhattan, and I was coming down with a cold, and I noticed my wife had ordered chicken soup. I thought, well, maybe that'd be good for my cold. So I asked a waiter if I could have an empty bowl to share my wife's soup. And he looked at me with kind of contempt and stalked off and flung the bowl in front of me. And I thought, okay, this guy gets no tip. I'm not coming back to this restaurant. And later, after the meal, my cold was getting worse. And I stopped a different waiter. I said, um, what teas do you have? Thinking it might help me with my cold. He looked at me very empathically, really tuned in. He said, you look like you're coming down with a cold. Then he went into a litany of all the teas that his mother used to make for him when he was sick and which one they had. And he recommended one of those. And I thought, okay, this guy gets the tip. I'm going to come back to this restaurant. The bottom line is how people feel after the interaction is not just how they feel about you, it's how they feel about your organization, your clinic, your hospital, and you as a healthcare professional. So it does really matter. There's another dimension. I want to talk about caring, which I said is so important for healthcare professionals. There was a study done at Princeton University with people training for the seminary, and they were an experiment given topics for a practice sermon. Half of them were given the parable of the Good Samaritan who stopped to help the stranger in need by the side of the road. The other half were given random Bible topics. And one by one, they were told to go to another building where they'd give the practice sermon and be rated. On the way over there, they passed someone who was bent over and moaning in pain. And the question is, did they stop to help the stranger in need? The more interesting question is, did it matter if they're thinking about the parable of the Good Samaritan? It turned out it didn't make any difference. What mattered was whether they felt time pressured. And in today's medical environment, all too many health professionals feel that kind of pressure. So, how can we do something beforehand so you'll respond with caring, effortlessly and spontaneously in the moment with a patient or with someone else? I think the answer is to cultivate compassion. And I'm going to share with you a strategy for doing this. It's a mental strategy, but it's found in research at many universities now to actually make people more generous, more caring, more likely to help. And I'm going to ask you for this to close your eyes if you feel comfortable and to imagine someone who's been kind to you in your life and think about them, wish for them. May you be safe, happy, healthy. May you have a life where you thrive. Just repeat that silently to yourself with that person in mind. And then bring to mind yourself and say silently, may I be safe, happy, healthy. May I have a life where I thrive. Then think of people you love and imagine them in your mind. Picture them and say, may you be safe, healthy, happy, free from suffering. May you have a life where you thrive. Say that a few times silently with them in mind. And then bring to mind the people you work with and the people you care for, the patients, and say, may you be safe, happy, healthy, free from suffering. May you have a life of fulfillment. May you thrive. And repeat that silently to yourself a few times with those people in mind. And then finally, you can do it for everyone everywhere, saying, may you all be safe, happy, healthy, free from suffering. May you have lives of fulfillment. May you thrive. And now you can open your eyes. The research shows that if you do that daily, or if you do it whenever you have free moments, it actually does activate the circuits for caring and compassion in your brain and make you more likely to spontaneously act in a way that shows caring, that shows helping. And that is what people want from their healthcare professional. There's another thing too, and that is that emotional intelligence matters in any career, whether you become a leader or a part of a team or you're involved actively in patient care. The healthcare profession has many kinds of roles for people. The three top competencies for healthcare generally are empathy, resilience, and being able to influence people, influence them for their own good. If we can have the next slide, please. This is a very rough view, side view of the brain. And if you know neuroanatomy, I apologize. But the two parts of the brain I want to call attention to are the prefrontal cortex and the emotional centers, which are in the midbrain, particularly the amygdala, which acts as a radar for threat or salience. And imagine, if you will, a snowy day. I know it doesn't snow much in Sao Paulo and parts of Brazil, but this was in New England, and there was a 5-year-old, and he wanted to go out and play. So he told his mom, asked his mom, "Could I go out and play?" And she says, "Sure, but put your snowsuit on." If you don't know what a snowsuit is, it's a one piece that's insulated. When you zip it up, it keeps you warm even in the snow. So this 5-year-old didn't want to do it. He had a tantrum. He said, "No, there's no way I'll do it." He started yelling at his mom, "No." And then all of a sudden, he stopped. He went to his room, came back after a few minutes with his snowsuit on, started to go out to play. And his mom says, "Hey, what just happened?" He says, "Oh, my guard dog got upset. So I had my wise owl talk to it." And that is brain science for a 5-year-old. It basically, he's talking about the prefrontal cortex, his wise owl, and the emotional centers, which are the center for emotional impulse. Every emotion is a impulse to move some way. The stronger the emotion, the more it matters. But the prefrontal cortex is where we're rational, where we make good decisions, where we plan, where we comprehend, where we learn. For healthcare, it's absolutely essential. But don't ignore the emotional centers, because the brain is wired for survival. And that means that in prehistory and early human history, even now, our brains are wired so the emotional centers can hijack the prefrontal cortex if it thinks there's an emergency. I want to call your attention to the book by Danny Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow. The emotional centers are very fast. The prefrontal cortex and brain time is relatively slow. There was a brilliant corporate lawyer who had a prefrontal brain tumor. It was discovered early, luckily, operated on, but during the course of the surgery, they created a lesion between the prefrontal cortex and the emotional centers. After surgery, it was odd because he was as smart as ever, according to tests. His cognition was as good, his memory was as good, but he couldn't do his job anymore. He lost his job. He couldn't do any job. He ended up living in his brother's spare bedroom. And in despair, he went to an expert in this very circuitry, a neurologist named Antonio Damasio. And he says, "Doctor, what's wrong with me?" And at first, Damasio didn't know. He was okay on every test. Then he asked the lawyer, "When should we have our next appointment?" And he realized that that lawyer could give him the rational pros and cons of every hour or minute, really, for the next week, but he didn't know which was best. And Damasio reasons that it's because of that lesion between the prefrontal cortex and the emotional centers. He says, our life experience, what worked well, what didn't work. When we said that, it was good. When we said this other thing was bad, all of that information, our life wisdom, is stored for us in very primitive basal parts of the brain. And when we face a decision, those parts of the brain tell us what it thinks is the better decision, but it has no connection to the part of the prefrontal cortex that thinks in words. It has no connection to the part of the prefrontal cortex that thinks in words. It only has connection to the GI tract. So we get a feeling, feels right, doesn't feel right. And those somatic markers, Damasio claims, are absolutely crucial. The signs of an emotional hijack are that you have a very quick emotional response. It's very negative, and the telltale sign is when it's all over, you regret what you said or you did. And if we could have the next slide, please, the last slide. This is a different way of looking at it. Here on the left is whether our performance is excellent or bad. And on the bottom is, it says mobilization of the brain. Actually, it's a measure of cortisol, a stress hormone, which gets us up in the morning. That's good. But if it's too much, we feel anxiety and stress. And you want to stay in that optimal state. That's where performance is at its best. That's where you can take in information uh, totally. You can analyze it well, and then you can respond most appropriately. But if you're frazzled, if you have constant stress and you never recover, then you're going to have a negative reaction. Your brain is not going to take in information well. You're going to actually fall back because you're doing a hijack on overlearned responses, and it may not be the best response. So let me finish by suggesting to you, as mental health professionals of the future, that it's very important for you to schedule a time to recover from stress. Stress is part of the territory in healthcare professions, but remember the difference between sympathetic nervous system arousal and parasympathetic arousal. It's the fight or flight response. The emotional hijack is the sympathetic response. The parasympathetic response is what the body is wired for. And it means you have recovery. You let your body restore itself, and it helps you go back into the situation. And I'm going to recommend to you that you schedule whatever the rest of your day looks like, the stressful part, you schedule recovery time. You find something that's totally relaxing. It might be being with loved ones or playing with a kid or a pet, or meditation or yoga, whatever it is. I think it's very important that you make time for it daily. It may look like a waste of time. It's not. It actually is preparing you for the next stressful event, for going back to work. So I'm going to leave you with that. Good luck to you.